Joseph, thank you very much for being here. I am very happy that you agreed to this conversation, to this, let's call it interview, but it's more like a conversation. And it's actually very nice to meet you. This is the first time we ever talk, and I ask you and the audience. Sorry for my English, as probably many of you know, English is not my main language, so I may have some difficulties. But I ask for your understanding. So today we're going to talk about the traditional Latin Mass, Gregorian Chant, pilgrimages, and Latin. And all those topics are very interesting to me. I have them in my heart. And in a second, I will introduce Joseph, but I just want to say that we have been following each other for some months now. And I think Joseph has very interesting takes on the church and on religion and on tradition. I am always very happy to read his posts. So that's how he piqued my interest. And I took a little bit of a look in the Latin Mass Society website, and everything looks great, looks very exciting, looks very interesting. And I have to tell you that a lot of my audience actually seems to be interested in Latin because of the, let's say, ecclesiastical side of Latin. So many people want to learn Latin or are already learning Latin because they want to read Christian texts. And I am a Catholic myself, so I understand their interest in this sense. So I think a lot of them will be very happy to actually get a better understanding of what the traditional Latin Mass is, what Gregorian Chant is, and what's the let's say, the role of Latin in all these very interesting topics. Not just for the Catholics, I think, but for everyone who's interested in traditions. I think all these topics are very interesting. So let me introduce Joseph, and then I will give you the word, okay? So Joseph is a British philosopher, writer, and the chairman of the Latin Mass Society. And he is, as I said, very active on X. So I advise everyone to follow him, and it's a very good follow. So Joseph, to you the word.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted. This is my first time on this aspect of the platform, so this is quite exciting for me. Thank you for the introduction. I've been involved in the Latin Mass Society, promoting liturgical tradition, promoting Latin, and related issues for more than 10 years now, and I've written some books about it, which you can see through my, if you go to my profile, and I too, I'm a Catholic. Obviously, I'm a cradle Catholic. Latin Mass Society was founded in 1965, so a bit before I was born, to preserve the ancient Catholic Mass as it existed in up to about 1965. So that was entirely in Latin, except for, of course, the readings could be repeated or sermon in local vernacular. But otherwise, it was in Latin, and if it was sung, it was the singing was in Latin, with using Gregorian chant, and it was famous. The Catholic Mass was famous all over the world with non-Catholics. It influenced the Japanese tea ceremony. Apparently, the Japanese, of course, is a highly ritual culture in Japan, and they saw the Mass and they saw something which they could understand. And in the same way, people all over the world of traditional religiosity, as we might call it, animists in Africa, Aztecs in Central America, our own northern non-Christian ancestors from Germany and so on, they all recognized in the Mass something impressive, and we still do today, because it speaks to us at a level which is more than just words. But if you understand the words, that is a bonus. That's an extra thing. People sometimes think that if the Mass is in Latin, you can't understand it. It's impossible to understand. But of course, that's not true. You don't have to have very much Latin to be able to locate yourself in a ritual, which is very much the same each time it's done. and you can understand what's going on because you've seen it before, because you've had it explained to you, because you've had catechism, because perhaps you even have a text in front of you. So in modern times, of course, people had books with the Latin and the vernacular side by side. So it wasn't at all incomprehensible. But the fact that it was in this special language gave it a special status. When the Latin started, you knew that a sacred space had opened up, something which was outside ordinary life, something outside, we might even say, in ordinary space and time, which was a sacred space. And that made it easier for people to pray. They appreciated that as something which put them in touch with the divine.
Yes, and let me interrupt you a little bit. You have given us a great overview of what the traditional Latin Mass is and the reasons for actually attending this Mass. And I would argue that the reasons of its existence, even in today's world, let's say. But let me take you a couple step backs, because I will explain to you a little bit of why, for example, a person like me is interested in the traditional Latin Mass, but knows very little about it. So, for example, I live in Italy, and there are traditional Latin Masses, of course, that I have attended, as I think many of the listeners and many people in the audience, but they are more difficult to access. I mean, they are not as popular as the, let's say, normal Mass. So the times I've been there, I found the traditional Latin Mass very interesting, very beautiful, very exciting to be there. It's a great experience to be there, but I don't understand much about it. I don't understand much about like the different parts of it, the different processes of it, even though I know Latin. So I would like you to explain to us, if it's possible, what are the main differences beyond the language? What are the main differences between the traditional Latin Mass and the normal Mass that we attend every Sunday?
Yes, well, that's a slightly complicated question, and it's, if you go to a traditional Mass, the first thing that happens is something that doesn't happen in the Reformed Mass, the Novus Ordo. So that's a bit confusing. So you have this thing called the prayers at the foot of the altar, the preparatory prayers, which is said between the priest and the server. Sometimes the congregation joins in as well, and they are in origin prayers of preparation, spiritual preparation for the clergy before celebrating Mass. So they got rid of those, but they're very beautiful. It's called the Psalm Judica. So that is a kind of preparation which we share in with the priest now, and have done since about the 9th century. So it's not a recent thing. And then you get to the prayers and things which you perhaps do correspond to the Novus Ordo. So you have the collect, the Kyrie, Gloria on Sunday, the readings, and then perhaps a sermon, and then the canon, which is now called the Eucharistic prayer after the offertory. The offertory is completely different in the Reformed Mass, but there is an offertory. But the prayers are completely changed. The canon in the Eucharistic prayer used in the traditional Mass it corresponds to Eucharistic prayer number 1, if you're familiar with the Novus Ordo. And of course, it's said silently in Latin. And it's been changed very slightly. But that's basically Eucharistic prayer number 1. And then there's the Agnus Dei communion and the post-communion prayers and things. And at the very end, again, there's something which is completely gone in the Novus Ordo, which is called the last gospel. So he gives the blessing, he gives the dismissal, and instead of going away, processing out of the church, the priest goes to the left-hand side of the altar as you're looking at it, and he reads the opening 16 verses of the Gospel of St. John. In the beginning was the Word, and so on. And this is a kind of blessing, an extra blessing for the people. The traditional Mass is filled with blessings. Every now and then he turns around and says, "The Lord be with you." And that happens in the Novus Ordo, but it happens more frequently in the traditional mass. It's also filled with little things which have almost not completely disappeared, like the kissing of the altar. He does it twice in the Novus Ordo. He does it 5 times in the traditional mass, something like that. I can never remember these things exactly, but there are all sorts of little things which are there or not there from one mass to the other, which contribute to its interest, its depth, the symbolic meaning of it. And you can read books about these things. And if you don't read the books, nevertheless, they're there. They're kind of intriguing little details, which you may notice or may not even notice the first, 20 times you go. You'll notice more and more because there's more and more to see.
Okay.
And go on.
No, yeah, go on.
Well, I was going to say that these are some of the things which make it the people who experienced the reform. It was painful to them to see these things taken away because they were so familiar with it. If they were adults in 1964 and through into the 1971. They saw progressively more and more of these things taken away, the kissings of the altar, signs of the cross, blessings, last gospel. And it was a very painful experience for them.
Yes, I can imagine. And as you said, the traditional Latin Mass is full of very powerful symbolism that even if you don't understand, like me, for example, I don't understand the single parts or I don't understand the complete meaning, you still receive the impact of the symbolism. Now,
Yes.
Let me ask you a little bit about the history of the traditional Latin Mass, because you have mentioned this year quite some times now, 1964, I think. I would like to know what happened in 1964 that changed the way we conceive Mass. And also another question would be, and maybe more immediate or before you answer the other question is, can we say with some confidence that the traditional Latin Mass is the Mass that was celebrated, let's say, 1,000 years ago, or I don't know, 1,500 years ago, or rather, how long in the past, how far in the past can we be certain that the elements of the traditional Latin Mass were the same?
Yeah. Okay. So in 1964, that was the year during the course of the Second Vatican Council that it was permitted to say a large part of the Mass in the vernacular. And it was the moment that, well, first of all, priests adopted this permission with great enthusiasm. With or without enthusiasm, they adopted it. So suddenly it became very difficult to find a Mass celebrated entirely in Latin. And so this meant that the liturgical experience of the faithful was completely changed. It's a very different proposition going to Mass entirely in a sacred language and going along where everything is said in Italian or French or English. It was at that moment that people woke up to there's something huge changing. And of course, they didn't know that even more was going to change. The rubrics, the texts, the readings, everything was going to change. But even though they didn't know that, they still thought, gosh, this is a huge thing. And we must gather together organizations to beg them to at least keep some masses in Latin so that we can have that liturgical experience which we grew up with and which we value so much. So that was why the very first, Latin Mass Society groups, Una Voce groups, were founded. So Una Voce France that very year, 1964, Latin Mass Society early the following year, and so on. So your other question about the history of the Latin Mass. So we know a good deal about the development of the liturgy because, of course, we have books. We have the physical books, the missals from different centuries, and you can see quite, fairly clearly what changed, what stayed the same. So if a priest celebrates the Mass according to the traditional Latin Mass, as we would call it today, with a book printed normally in 1960, and if you then swapped in a book printed in 1540, he wouldn't notice the difference. There are differences; they're very small. really, really small. I mean, you'd have to have a magnifying glass, literally, to see them. There are some new feasts, but really, it's almost identical to the very first missals that came off the printing press, not after the Council of Trent, but before the Council of Trent. So the very first printed missal of the Latin Rite, the Roman Mass, was in the 15th century, so 14 something, and it's the same as the one that came out after Trent. And there are other, of course, non-printed, written out by hand missals going back to the 13th century, and sometimes they're called the Missale Romano Seraphicum because they were used by the Franciscans. So the Franciscans, of course, were founded in Assisi. Assisi was one of the places where the popes had spent time, so they adopted the specific form of liturgy were used by the popes. And so St. Francis took this form of liturgy all over Europe. And if that's what you were used to, then that would be exactly the same as what you got today. Now, there were other missals, other liturgical traditions around in Europe at that time, and there still are, traditional ones, that is. So at the time of the Second Vatican Council, several religious orders had their own, like Dominicans. The city, the Diocese of Milan had its own, it still does, and so on and so forth. So these are kind of interesting variations, but they're pretty similar. But if you had gone to those, you would have found, there would have been differences. There would have been kind of extra things or missing things. Or the Dominicans have a slightly different confiteor because they want to talk about St. Dominic, and they want to pick him out as someone to pray for them when you list the saints who are going to pray for you, and so on and so forth. But yes, I would say that all these different, the atmosphere is very similar. You have this sacred atmosphere. You're enveloped in the Latin and the chants and the ceremonies in the same way.
Yes. So we can be certain, we can be sure that the most of the liturgy of the traditional Latin Mass goes at least as back or as far as to the Middle Ages. Let's say that we can be completely certain.
We have physical missals going back to the 7th century. And so that's not exactly the same, because there are things that got added and some things that fell out of use. But it's very much the ancestors. They're a very clear line of descent, and the changes are gradual and small, and they're not to the most essential part, which is the canon Eucharistic prayer. That has been absolutely unchanged.
Okay, I see.
Throughout those centuries.
From here we can talk about many things, but one of the things I would like to discuss is what are the causes behind the decision to open the liturgy to the vernacular languages? Because you have told us a little bit about the history, and if I understood correctly, actually the decision was not to eliminate the traditional Latin Mass, but to open some space in the liturgy to the vernacular languages. And actually was received positively by the priests, but eventually that expanded until today, where most of the masses are in our vernacular languages. Is that a correct way to frame it?
Well, well, let me put it in my own words. So, the Second Vatican Council said that there could be a reform of the liturgy, and they made some rather vague statements of principle about it. On the one hand, they said nothing should be changed unless it would clearly and certainly be of benefit to the Church, to the faithful. And on the other hand, they said, well, perhaps there could be simplifications, and that can mean anything. And perhaps we can have greater range of readings in the lectionary. So it was picked up by this priest, Monsignor Annibale Bugnini, who was appointed to oversee this, and he got a group of experts, liturgical experts, and they set about a very, very radical reform of the liturgy. And the first thing they did was to allow vernacular, and then they cut out the present at the foot of the altar, the preparatory prayers, and the last gospel, as I've already mentioned, and they started chopping out other things, and they were kind of intermediate things. And then in 1969, the first out of Advent, they produced this entire mass. So the order of mass, as they called it, the ordo, was completely, well, obviously there's a relationship, but it's substantially different. It's as different from the traditional mass as the mass of the Greek Orthodox, for example. In fact, it's probably more different in some ways than the mass of a completely different rite, like the Greeks or the Russians or whatever.
Now that you mentioned that, can I interrupt you to make a quick question? So the mass in the Catholic Church has changed a lot, but that cannot be said of other churches. For example, you mentioned the Greek Orthodox Church. Their liturgy remains the same, or that liturgy changed too? I mean,
well, there was no reform of the liturgy in 1969.
okay.
I mean, it's those liturgies, they have developed over the centuries in a similar way. The Roman liturgy developed over the centuries very gradually. So there's a very, very kind of conservative kind of principle of preservation, of fidelity to tradition in the Eastern churches, just as there was in the Western church, right up until that time. Now, as a matter of fact, if you go there today, if you go to the liturgy of the Greeks or whatever, you will find sometimes they do use the vernacular, and it's a debate going on there. But it's certainly, you haven't had the same kind of brutal kind of replacement of one liturgy with another, and I think that I think most people would say that would be inconceivable for the Eastern churches. It was just, it's not what you do to the liturgy. You don't kind of scrap one, tear it up, throw it in the fire. You even liturgies which are left behind by liturgical developments and one thing spreading and replacing something else, they are still preserved on special days. So you have I can't remember their names now, but there's a different missal which is used on the feast of St. Basil, I think, which was the liturgy associated with him. It's not lost. It's preserved and held in honor. Whereas in the West, there was this kind of denigration of the traditional mass after the new mass came out, which is a very kind of anti-traditional mindset.
I can imagine that the will to renovate, or as you said, almost eliminate the traditional Latin Mass was part of a bigger spirit, let's say, within the church that I know nothing about. So if you want to illustrate that further, I would gladly hear you. But I guess that a lot of that also had to do with the fact that, and you mentioned this, people maybe could not understand the Latin of the Mass. And I know a little bit of the history of that Latin and how it was taught in the previous century. And more or less around the time after the Second World War, Latin stopped being taught gradually in high schools and universities. So it actually makes sense that in the time of, let's say, 1 or 2 generations from the Second World War to the date of 1964, people actually stopped understanding Latin. Like, it makes a lot of the dates make a lot of sense, let's say. Do you think that it was actually that one of the reasons to stop celebrating the Mass in Latin, that people could not understand Latin?
Well, it didn't help, but I don't actually think that was the key thing. I know that in Italy, Latin education was taken very, very seriously until very recently. And indeed, even today, it's taken more seriously than in other countries for reasons which are obvious, because it's your particular heritage. But, even in the old days, even before the Second World War, how many adult Italians would have gone into church without a missal and understood everything that was being said? Now, they would have understood it in the way that I described at the beginning, which is they would have heard, perhaps the Gloria being sung, and they say, oh, this is the Gloria. And I know what the Gloria is because I've seen it in a book. I've seen it in school. I know I'm very familiar with the Latin because I've sung it 100 times. So they understand, but they wouldn't understand it from a grammatical point of view. And similarly, when when they attended Vespers or something, I mean, they'd be thoroughly familiar with it. They wouldn't be kind of uncomprehending. They wouldn't be kind of bewildered. But would they have been able to sit a kind of test on the Latin of the? No, because most people, I mean, before the war in Italy, just like in other countries, most people were not highly educated. I mean, even to the level of a high school diploma or something like that. So some attempt would have been made to get some Latin into them, but actually it was quite tough. So Catholic schools in England, they taught people Latin, quote unquote, but when they came out, could they then understand a Latin sentence that you put in front of them? Well, probably not. But they would have enough Latin to understand it in a kind of broader sense. Now, of course, that is undermined by a lack of Latin education, but it doesn't matter all that much from the point of view of getting something spiritually out of the Mass. Because as we can see going further back into the history, when there was not such widespread education, medieval people without education were passionately attached to the Latin Mass. They would get up before dawn to go to Mass on a work day before going to the fields. They would, they'd rush to church when they heard the bell ringing in order to see the elevation. They were spiritually very, very attached to this. And when clever people came along and said, "Oh, you peasants, you don't understand what it's all about," they were very angry. And there were kind of, battles about this in the course of the Middle Ages when the heresies arose about it. What did they get out of it? It was spiritual. It wasn't intellectual. Going to the liturgy is not an intellectual exercise. Now, it's enhanced by a grasp of Latin. It's enhanced by an intellectual engagement. But you don't want to let that take over. Attending Mass is not the moment to be wondering about, interesting use of the ablative absolute. Oh, look at this. It's a passive subjunctive or something. You don't want to be thinking about that. You're thinking about God. So it's a different kind of problem. The problem of the 60s was they had lost touch with the ordinary faithful's mode of engagement with the liturgy. And this is a result of the elite adopting, who probably did know Latin, the elite adopted rationalism. So people like, Annibale Bugnini, even Paul VI, would look at a liturgical experience and say, you can't really get anything out of it unless you can understand it word by word. Now, that's a very rationalistic understanding of the Catholic liturgy, and it just doesn't fit what ordinary people had done for centuries. Now, another way of looking at it is this: you think of the canon, the Eucharistic prayer. Now, it's a beautiful piece of writing, absolutely beautiful, and the poetry is sublime, and it's very evocative. It refers to all sorts of different things. There's lists of saints. There's reference to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All those things. And you know what? It was said silently. Who could understand those words? Who, sitting in church, kneeling in church, watching the priest, who could understand that Latin? Well, no one, because it wasn't said out loud. But this was a profound spiritual experience.
Okay. It's actually a very, very interesting point you are making. If you want to continue, tell me. Because actually that connects well with, let's say, a common criticism. Even to me, when I published that I was going to have a conversation with you, someone, maybe a troll, commented that for the church, maintaining the liturgy in Latin was, and I am being the devil's advocate here, a way of keeping the word of God from the common people. So that's a very common, let's say, even I would say vain or even superficial criticism. But it is something that, you know, the normal person who is not that much into Latin or into this or into that would make. And you're making the point that the mass, the liturgy, is not an intellectual experience; it is an spiritual experience.
Yes.
So I think that is very important. If you could elaborate on that point a little bit more, and taking into account this, let's say, this common criticism, and what we could reply to people who believe that that's the reason why, for example, you or me or someone else would want to return to that tradition.
No, absolutely. This is tremendously important, and I'm grateful to you for raising it in those terms, because they're as what people say. So, just as a initial counterpoint, there's a priest called Father Brian Houghton who wrote about this sort of thing, and he remarks, having gone through the experience of the liturgical reform, he said it was often the case that it was the people who knew Latin least who most regretted its disappearance. So the idea that this was a great boon to people who the vernacularization, putting everything into the language of the street, was a great boon to people, is actually the opposite of the truth. It was an elite project based on an elite way of engaging with the liturgy. So highly educated people in the 1960s, and of course before and after, they wanted to engage in the liturgy in an intellectual way. They wanted to understand every word. Why? Because they were highly verbal people. They were people with degrees, people who were writers, people who were perhaps linguistic experts. They engaged in words. They were people of words. Now, ordinary people, particularly children, men perhaps more than women, but ordinary people in general, working class people, they don't primarily engage, or at least not to the same extent, with the world through words. Now that might seem, and that might sound patronizing, and I don't want to be patronizing at all. I think it's a perfectly legitimate way of engaging with reality. So you think of a football crowd. The experience of a football crowd, which can be very intense and of great significance to people who are there. It's not verbal at all. It's not about words. It's about what they can see, and it's about their fellow feeling. Now, that means nothing to the kind of highly educated, verbal-oriented people. They want a great big text to get their teeth into. That's not how ordinary people behave. So again, think of your relationship with a child, a small child. Think of your relationship with your lover. Think of your relationship with a close family member. Is it all about conversation? Well, of course it comes into it, but there's something else as well, which is not verbal at all. Now, the idea that we're keeping people away from a fruitful engagement with the liturgy by having it in a sacred language, it's question begging, because it assumes that the only valid engagement with the liturgy is a verbal engagement. Actually, I would say a verbal engagement with the liturgy is a superficial engagement. Now, don't take my word for it. If you're listening to this and you're Catholic, look at the section on prayer in the Catechism, John Paul II's Catechism, which is a very beautiful description of prayer, and look at what it has to say about contemplative, wordless prayer. Prayer without words is the highest form of prayer. It's the most intense form of prayer. It's the deepest form. It's the prayer to which we should aspire. Now, are we keeping people away from proper prayer by encouraging them to engage wordlessly?
Is what you're saying is actually very interesting, also in the sense of my own experience, and I think of the experience of the people listening here, when we attend a traditional Latin Mass. That is, we feel or we experience almost a mystical experience, let's say.
Yes.
Just want to be sure of something. Are you referring to the Catechesi Tradendae by John Paul II? It's the only thing I could find just to write the reference that you're talking about.
Well, in English, it's called the Catechism of the Catholic Church.
Okay, it's called the Catechism of the Catholic Church by John Paul II.
Well, he authorized it,
Okay.
and it came out in 1992 or something like that in English. It's online. It's on the Vatican website.
Okay.
And so on.
I will take a look, and I advise everyone to take a look, because what you just told us sounds actually very, very interesting. And it's something that people actually don't mention very often, that praying without words is actually the most potent or most powerful way of praying. I think that's a very important thing to remark. But let me actually transition to the Latin aspect, because,
yes.
Okay, given that, I mean, taking that point that you just made and that we have been talking about for the last minutes, we can also nevertheless say that knowing Latin and learning Latin could enhance the experience of the traditional Latin Mass, and not only the traditional Latin Mass, but also the approach we have to the text of our tradition. Because me personally, I like a lot, I love actually reading the text of, I don't know, St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas or many others in Latin, or even the prayers in Latin and many other texts. So there is a reason, there is a way in which Latin can enhance our experience as Catholics. So
Absolutely.
What's your thought about that? I mean, let's go to the intellectual part more than the mystical part. And what is the, let's say, the advantage, or how can we, if we had to sell Latin to Catholics, once again, how could we convince them that learning Latin will actually help them approach their religiosity in a richer way?
Yes. Well, the Church's tradition, as speaking as a Western Catholic, a Catholic of the Latin rite, is Latin. Everything is in Latin. The poetry, the spiritual writings of the spiritual masters, the philosophy, the law, the administration, as well as the liturgy, is all in Latin, right up until the 1960s, 70s. Even now, official documents are promulgated in Latin, and woe betide you if you are relying on vernacular translations, because you are relying on someone else trying to understand a document. Sometimes someone trying to change the meaning of a document deliberately in order to mislead people. I've seen this so often now with official documents of the Church that I simply do not believe that the mistakes they make are not deliberate in many cases. So if you are trying to engage in Catholic history, culture, spirituality, literature without Latin, you are doing it with one arm, at least maybe two arms tied behind your back. It's really important. And I say this as someone who is a terrible linguist. My Latin is not particularly good. I have the kind of Latin where if there's something egregiously wrong with a translation, I can look at the Latin and see, oh, yes, I can see. I can't sit down in an armchair and just read through a Latin text. So, you know, even my Latin is a lot better than having no Latin at all. And I really admire people who have, you know, really good Latin, and I encourage everyone to get a better, you know, in accordance with the, you know, the level of engagement you want to have with the tradition. Otherwise, you're seeing it through someone else's eyes, and that's true in every area. As I
Yes.
said,
Yes, thank you. Actually, if I can add something, I usually say here in the Learn Latin account is that one of the reasons to learn Latin is to not having to trust other person's translation.
Yeah,
and that applies not only to Catholic texts. By the way, this applies to all kind of texts in the tradition. What you just mentioned, the fact that some people translate things in order to adjust the translation to their own ideology or to their own objectives and so on happens very often in all kinds of fields, not only in the Catholic field. So I also believe that learning Latin, for example, allows you to get into contact with the materiality of tradition. I try to post a lot about manuscripts, for example. I think people are attracted by beauty, and when they see an illuminated manuscript written in Latin, these beautiful chorales and so on, I think people are attracted to this, and knowing Latin allows you to read the text, understand the texts, and I think you get in touch not only with the let's say the abstract content of it, but also with the materiality that transmitted the tradition. Actually, tradition comes from the verb tradere, which means to give, to transmit. So I think getting in touch with this materiality of things is actually very important. Now, I would like to transition a little bit to another aspect that unites in some way, for a lot of people, me included, Latin and the traditional Mass, and that is Gregorian chant. Yes. I will tell you just briefly that when I was a child, my first contact into Latin was actually through Gregorian chant. I bought a CD. I didn't know what it was about. I just bought it because of the front of the cover. It was a bunch of monks that looked very mysterious. So I bought it, I listened to it, and I was immediately in love with Gregorian chant, even though I could not understand the Latin. And with this, I come back to the thing you just said. You don't need to understand intellectually the text to be in love with it and to be moved and touched by that. But certainly, when I actually understood Latin a little bit better, when I was learning Latin, and I came back to those texts, just to mention one very famous, the Dies Irae, you find that it's actually beautiful, extremely beautiful, powerful texts.
Yes.
And singing them and listening to them, and I am a terrible singer, by the way, but even listening to them is a very, very powerful experience. Just listening to them in your computer or through YouTube or when you're running or whatever, but listening to Gregorian chant during the Mass is extremely, extremely powerful. So I would like you to, if you can, to tell us a little bit about why we chant Gregorian chant in the traditional Latin Mass, and what is the relationship between chanting in Latin and the traditional Mass?
Yes, well, you're right about the texts. The Dies Irae is of course a text, as it were, composed by the Church. Many chants are sections of Scripture, but the Dies Irae and the Gloria and certain other things are new texts, as it were, which are enormously profound theologically. So why do we sing at all? The answer that some people give is you can hear it more easily. You can proclaim it to a wider group of people without electronic amplification. And why vary the tone? Why not sing it in a monotone? If you sing it in a monotone, you'll go flat. So you have to have a little kind of twiddles and things in order to maintain the pitch. So that's a very utilitarian explanation. But of course, it's a way of giving the texts greater solemnity. And that's exactly what you want to do in the context of the liturgy. You want to give them greater solemnity. So the priest sings the gospel at a sung mass and the epistle to these very beautiful chant tones, we call them, which are fairly plain. Which actually it does different things, whether it's a question or a statement. So it actually makes it easier to follow. You can see, oh yeah, so that's when he's asking this question. And then you have these more elaborate chants. We call them melismatic chants. So between the first reading and the gospel, we have these the gradual chant, the Alleluia chant, and sometimes something like the Dies Irae, which is a sequence, and they have a kind of a role in introducing the gospel. Sometimes they're quotations from the gospel. Sometimes they refer to other parts of the Mass, and it sets the tone, spiritually, for what will come. So it's part of the liturgical experience to have these things, and then you have the after the gospel, you have the preface, and Mozart said that he would have given anything to have been able to compose the preface, which is interesting. It's a very beautiful musically, and then you have silence. So if singing is more solemn than spoken text, silence is another kind of solemnity. It's another kind of signal that you're now moving into something still more sacred. So it's you have a kind of a series of steps going upwards towards the high point of the Mass, which is the consecration.
Yes, thank you very much. I want to make a little space for people listening to this conversation. If some of you want to ask a question, this would be a good moment to raise your hand or ask me for the microphone. In the meantime, let me ask you a little bit about the pilgrimages, because I want to come back to the Latin Mass Society, actually. And I want to know more about what are the opportunities and what are the activities and the main events of the Latin Mass Society, of which you are the chairman. And I was looking at the website and I read something about pilgrimages. And it's interesting because all these activities, traditional Latin Mass, Latin, Gregorian Chant, pilgrimage, are associated by people to mystical experience in some way. And having done a little pilgrimage myself, I know that this can be very transformative experiences too. So could you tell us a little bit about how are these things connected in the activity or within the activity of the Latin Mass Society?
Yes. Well, the Latin Mass Society, as with Una Voce Italia and Una Voce America, and these groups all over the world, we want to preserve not only the traditional Latin Mass, but also traditional devotions, traditional spirituality, and so on. And one of the things that disappeared, at least for a while after the Second Vatican Council, although the Second Vatican Council didn't call for this to disappear, but it did nevertheless disappear, was the tradition of pilgrimages. I think that the kind of people who were keen to get rid of Latin because they're rationalists, they didn't like the idea of sacred places because they thought it was irrational. They thought it was superstitious. This never became an official view of the church, but it went out of fashion because this rationalism was in fashion. Now that's changing now. So you can see the number of people who go on the pilgrimage to Compostela, for example, goes up year by year. It went really down in the 70s into a kind of very low point, but now it's back. And the people who've been promoting these, above all, have been traditional Catholics attached to the traditional Mass, and we've had long walking pilgrimages for a long time. So in the 80s, the French started this pilgrimage from Paris to Chartres, which is now enormous. So this year, 18,000 people walked 70 miles, 90 kilometers from Paris to Chartres, singing, praying, having the traditional Mass each day, and having this extraordinary experience, which is, and I've done it more than once, and it's indescribable. Taking part in that, in such a large thing as well. It wasn't nearly as big when I did it, but even so. So we have the Latin Mass Society. We have a walking pilgrimage, which is slightly shorter, from Ely in England to Walsingham, where there was a vision of Our Lady just before the Norman Conquest, so in the 11th century, which is growing. It's much smaller, more intimate. But what's the point of walking when you could go in a car? What's the point of going to Walsingham in Norfolk when you could just, pray to God in your own living room? Well, those are the questions which you are asked by someone who is a rationalist. And the answer, of course, is there's more than, there's more than this sort of utilitarian rationalistic understanding of the world. There's other things going on. Our Lord wants us to go to special places where he has shown favor to his special friends, the saints. He wants us to honor them by doing that, and he grants us graces if we do that. And the physical process of walking, actually the physical process, even of driving, a long way to a pub, even a short distance, I mean, it makes a difference. The effort that you put into something like that actually is a kind of spiritual preparation for the reception of graces. So these walking pilgrimages, and they're very tough. I like to think that the one we do in England is more humane than the French. I mean, the French are very tough. But it's we have nice meals and at the end of the day and things like that. It's not very big. We can still do that, but it's like walking 20 or 24 miles in a day, which is a very long way for most people to walk.
Yes.
And at the end of that, or even halfway through, you're kind of feeling slightly weird. And yes, this is a moment when God can break through to someone who's not normally very receptive,
Wow.
like me,
Yes.
like all of us,
Yes, actually, that is an extremely important point that I think it contrasts a lot with, for example, the way I was raised. I was born Catholic, I was raised Catholic, but I was used to what even a very, very famous account here on X, the Chivalry Guild sometimes calls the acoustic guitar Catholicism. And when you are raised into these very bland, very, let's say, untouching, unmoving ceremonies, when you start to realize that Catholicism is bigger than that, and it's full of beautiful millenary traditions like pilgrimages, and that they are special in the sense that they don't happen every day. There is the need of time, there is the need of effort, there is the need of planification, even I would say, in the example of the pilgrimages. And that this can be actually transformative experiences where, as you said, you can actually be more receptive to God. I think that is a very good point, and a very good, how can I say it? A very good point in favor of restoring and promoting these traditions within the Catholic Church, but also not only, I would say, to Catholic people, but also to people who are interested in a deeper religiosity. And I say this because I would like to ask you one question related, and that relates to 2 points. So we are now seeing, let's say, a rebirth of traditions. More and more young people. I am 30 years old, by the way. I'm not that young, but I have been interested in these topics since I was 25, more or less. So we see more and more young people interested in the traditional Latin Mass, in Latin, in Gregorian Chant, in pilgrimages, in this kind of more, I would call deeper, more thoughtful religiosity. But we still see many challenges to this. So I would like to ask you, what are those challenges concretely, and what is the Latin Mass Society doing now with, concretely in England, for example, to overcome these challenges, and how people can join these events and participate in these beautiful events.
Thank you. So, well, you'll see all our events on our website, Latin Mass Society. You just Google that, or lms.org.uk. We have our walking pilgrimage at the end of August. Something else which is of interest to perhaps your followers is our residential Latin course, which is just a week long, which is earlier in August, and you'll find all the details there. These are, we're under attack, you might say. We're under pressure from some people within the church. And unfortunately, these people seem to have had the ear of Pope Francis, who, having been relatively friendly, at least not unfriendly, to us for the first 10 years of his pontificate, suddenly he's decided that he wants to clamp down on us. Why has this happened? Well, it's obviously it's a complicated picture, but there are people who've always been opposed to us, and among them, particularly, there are people who were personally involved in making the changes in the 60s and 70s. So some of those changes were quite brutal. So, for example, they said we want to have a clear line of sight towards the altar. We want to have the priest facing the people, so everyone could see everything. So this is, again, a rationalistic attitude. So we physically destroy historic altar rails, stained glass, anything that impeded light or vision or seeing. And some of them, these were very beautiful things. Sometimes they've been given within living memory by people's parents and grandparents to the church. Sometimes they were criticized. Sometimes secular people who were interested in art were horrified about what was going on. Sometimes the church was horrified. The official church bodies who were involved were horrified by some of the things that were done. Now, if you did that and you convinced yourself that you're doing the right thing and there was suffering, you caused suffering, you have to say to yourself, well, yes, I did cause suffering, but it was worth it. It was necessary. Those people, they had to be brought round to seeing, the value of what I was doing. You can't then admit 40 years later that you were wrong, that it was all for nothing, that you bullied and overruled people, you ignored their objections, you smashed these irreplaceable works of art for nothing, and it was all an unfortunate mistake. That's extremely difficult to do. So those people who were in their 20s and 30s in 1965, they then grew up through the hierarchy. They became directors of seminaries, they became bishops, and they're now dying off. And they have some, of course, followers, some supporters in the younger generation, but there's an awful lot of them still who are very, very senior. And this is their last chance to crush the reaction against what they did. And the church, of course, is a gerontocracy. It's a rule by old men. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but we've got a very odd set of old men at the moment who were revolutionaries when they were younger. And if they don't stop this now, they'll be gone and they'll have lost. And this is their time. This is their chance.
Wow. I think your answer is very insightful, and I don't want to get people into polemics of any kind, because I know that within the Catholic Church there are currents, and there are obviously people who are against the traditional Latin Mass. I have even spoken to some of them, and I have heard the reasons. This account, of course, Learn Latin, is in favor of traditions. It is written very clearly in my bio. This account is in favor of Latin. This account is in favor of traditions. Being Catholic myself, I enjoy very much all the things that we have been talking about. And I think a big part of my audience and a big part of the people following this account are interested in this. So I think that without entering into polemics of any kind, without entering into dangerous territory, I think we must do what we can to support these initiatives. And that's actually one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, Joseph, because I think it's important to share the audiences a little bit and make, in this case, my audience aware that there exists these important realities, this important, in this case, society. I encourage everyone to follow Joseph. I encourage everyone to access the lms.org.uk website. I have been taking a look in these days, and I find I have found many important resources. There is a way to find the Mass in case you are in England and Wales. You can become a member. You can find them in Flickr, Twitter, Podbean, YouTube, Facebook, obviously here on X. And you can actually find some Latin resources if you want to learn Latin. There is the online Latin course. And as Joseph mentioned before, there is an in-person summer course, right, for Latin, for beginners, I guess.
Beginners and intermediate, I would say.
Beginners and intermediates. And is it a focus on the ecclesiastical Latin?
Yes, it is very much so.
That's very good, because a lot of people actually ask me where to find resources to learn Latin specifically for ecclesiastical purposes. So I think that is a great opportunity. You can take a trip to England. I've never been there. I am very curious, by the way, of knowing England. It looks like beautiful. It looks like a beautiful. It's the place of fairy tales for me. And so I hope to meet one day, to see one day England. And I encourage everyone, if you want to learn Latin and you want to see England, that is a great opportunity. You could also go to one of these traditional Latin masses, attend one of them. And yes, we are arriving to the conclusion of this fantastic conversation. I hope my English was not an obstacle to the flowing of the conversation or to the important things that Joseph had to tell us. And I ask you finally, Joseph, if there is anything else you think is important to highlight, or something you want to add to the conversation. I think it has been very insightful. I think you have given us a lot of things to think about, and I think a lot of things to ponder about, and I would say even motivation. To me, it's important for people learning Latin and for people who want to get deeper into traditions to be motivated, and listening to you and your reasons and your reflections on these things, I think it is very motivating. So if you want to add something else, to one final note.
Just to thank you very much. And I see in my notifications that I've got 18 new followers since this started. So thank you and your supporters very much. I agree with you very much about the need to avoid polemic. I think we have to have patience with people with different views and people of different generations. And they need to have patience, of course, with the younger people. They were young once. They were idealistic. They wanted to improve the church. They worked with the best intentions, and we do as well. And we are conscious that we can also make mistakes. I'd also add that on the ecclesiastical and classical Latin, it's the basic level Latin is Latin. But what we try to do in our courses and the book that we have, Simplicissimus, which is a textbook, by using examples from the Missal, for people who either want to, attend the Mass, or perhaps priests celebrate the Mass, or who already do, we try to make the most of the familiarity they already have. So we try to use examples which perhaps ring a bell with them, which they'll find easier to remember, or which are meaningful to them. So that's something to bear in mind in thinking about how you want to learn Latin. What's your target type of Latin? It's pretty well the same. It's not quite the same. Different vocabulary, different examples, slightly different conventions sometimes. But I'm very grateful to you and to your followers, and I hope that we can be part of a revival of this great tradition.
Yes, certainly. That's the main objective of all these efforts, and I thank you very much. It's me who is very grateful. It has been very nice to meet you, and it has been a great conversation. I think there was more or less 30 to 40 people listening throughout the conversation, so there was a lot of interest. I have to say, this is the first time I have let's say a conversation, chat, interview through the spaces, so this is new for me too. But I think that this is a great way to start actually hearing the voices of people who are making an effort for the revival of the traditions, for the diffusion of the traditions, for the promotion of the traditions. So I hope to meet you again sometime in the future. In the meantime, I will try to get your book, the book you were talking about, the Latin book, I will buy it definitely and review it and hopefully use some of the exercises in my own courses. And again, I encourage people to follow Joseph, go to the Latin Mass Society, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I will try to upload the conversation to the recording to YouTube, and I thank everybody very, very much, and especially you, Joseph.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody. Valete quam optime.